It all began on a quiet Tuesday morning. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the sleepy, suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek. Birds chirped, and the faint hum of lawnmowers could be heard in the distance. It was the kind of morning that made you want to sit on your porch with a cup of coffee and watch the world wake up. And that's exactly what I was doing. My name is Alex Carter, and I've lived in Willow Creek for about 5 years now. It's a nice enough place, quiet, well-kept, and filled with the kind of people who take pride in their perfectly manicured lawns and spotless driveways. But there was one person who took that pride to an entirely new level: Margaret Hargrove. Margaret was the self-proclaimed Queen of Willow Creek. She was the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, and she ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist. If your mailbox was even slightly off-center, you'd get a fine. If your grass was a shade too green, you'd get a warning. And God help you if you left your trash cans out for more than 5 minutes after the garbage truck had come by. Margaret had a knack for finding the smallest infractions and turning them into full-blown neighborhood scandals. I was lucky enough to live just outside the HOA's jurisdiction, which meant Margaret had no real power over me. But that didn't stop her from trying. She once tried to fine me for parking my own car in my own driveway, citing some obscure community aesthetic rule. I laughed it off and ignored her, thinking that would be the end of it. But I underestimated just how petty Margaret could be. The trouble really started at the local coffee shop. I was sitting at my usual table, sipping my latte and scrolling through my emails, when I overheard Margaret talking loudly to a group of women at the next table. She was bragging about planning the event of the decade, her daughter's wedding. "I'm not wasting money on some overpriced venue," Margaret declared, her voice carrying across the room. "We have perfectly good community land right here in Willow Creek. Why pay for something when we can use what's already ours?" My ears perked up at that. Community land? There was no such thing in Willow Creek. The only land that wasn't privately owned was a small park at the end of the street, and even though it was technically owned by the city. But as Margaret went on, listing off her plans, the massive tent, the catered alcohol service, the imported decorations from Italia, it dawned on me. She wasn't talking about community land. She was talking about my land. You see, a few years ago, I had purchased a large plot of land just outside the neighborhood. It was mostly wooded, with a small clearing that I used for the occasional bonfire or family gathering. But to Margaret, it was the perfect spot for her daughter's wedding. And she had no intention of asking for permission. I could have confronted her right then and there. I could have walked up to her, pulled out the property deed, and shut her down immediately. But where's the fun in that? Margaret had spent years making people's lives miserable with her power trips and petty rules. This was my chance to watch her hoist herself by her own petard, and I wasn't about to waste it. The next step was gathering intel. I needed to know exactly what Margaret was planning, and more importantly, how she planned to pull it off without anyone noticing. So, I started keeping an eye on her. I casually walked by her house later that weekend and saw her wedding planning board through the window. It was like something out of a military operation: color-coded schedules, vendor lists, seating arrangements. My land was ground zero. Margaret was so confident in her control over the neighborhood that she didn't even think twice about it. She had no idea that I was watching her every move or that I had the legal upper hand. Because while Margaret was busy being an HOA tyrant, I was busy being a federal agent. And as a federal agent, I knew that what she was about to do wasn't just morally wrong, it was legally disastrous. I started making calls. First, I contacted the ATF about the alcohol situation. Margaret had arranged for alcohol sales at the Wadinga Cash Bar, meaning she was about to sell alcohol without a permit. That alone was enough to get a raid organized. But then I dug deeper. Her brother-in-law, who was handling the liquor, had a history of selling bootlegged alcohol. That meant we weren't just looking at a permit issue, we're looking at felony charges. Oh, and let's not forget the trespassing. Legally speaking, the second Margaret and her guests stepped onto my land without permission, they were all committing a crime. I set the pieces in motion, made sure everything was in place, and then I sat back and waited. The week leading up to the wedding was a spectacle. Margaret ran the neighborhood like a dictator on a caffeine high, barking orders, making ridiculous demands, and acting like she was planning a royal coronation. She had construction crews setting up massive tents, catering VYCS hauling in truckloads of food, and rental companies delivering enough chairs and tables to seat a small country. And every single one of those things was being placed on my land. I watched it all unfold from my back porch, sipping my coffee and resisting the urge to wave. It was almost too easy. Then came the wedding day. Guests arrived in droves, stepping onto my property in their designer dresses and overpriced tuxedos, completely unaware that they were trespassing on federal land. Margaret was in full form, soaking in the attention and acting as if she had personally built this land from scratch. The ceremony began, the music swelled, and the bride and groom exchanged vows. Then came the toast. Margaret took center stage, raising her glass and beaming with pride as she prepared to deliver a speech about how her meticulous planning had led to this perfect day. She barely got through the first sentence before the siren started. The first wave came fast. ATF agents swarmed the liquor stands, shutting them down on the spot. The second wave was the police, blocking off the exits and informing guests that they were, in fact, trespassing. And then the Pista Resistencia helicopter hovering overhead, shining a spotlight right onto the main tent. Chaos erupted. Guests screamed, some bolted for the parking lot, while others stood frozen in confusion. The groom's side of the family tried to play it cool, but Margaret? Margaret was losing her mind. She marched straight up to the nearest federal agent and, in true Margaret fashion, demanded to speak to a manager. "I'll have you know, I am the HOA president," she shrieked, as if that meant anything in this situation. The agent, unfazed, handed her a legal notice detailing the charges: trespassing, illegal alcohol sales, and conspiracy to distribute unlicensed liquor. Margaret's face went from rage to confusion to horror in a matter of seconds. She turned to me, finally realizing that I had been standing there the whole time, arms crossed, watching the entire show. "You did this," she screeched. I just took a sip of my coffee. "No, Margaret. I just let you." The aftermath of the wedding raid was nothing short of legendary. The entire neighborhood was buzzing with rumors, half-truths, and outright lies, most of them spread by Margaret herself. According to her version of events, the government had unfairly targeted her. She had been set up by jealous neighbors, and of course, I was the mastermind behind her downfall. That last part was at least partially true, but I had simply given her the rope. She did all the tying and hanging on her own. The first few days after the fiasco, Margaret was uncharacteristically quiet. No surprise there, with her husband under investigation for fraud and her brother-in-law facing charges for illegally selling alcohol. She had her hands full with lawyers, court dates, and trying to maintain whatever was left of her reputation. But Margaret was nothing if not persistent. By the end of the week, she emerged from hiding, marching up and down the neighborhood, knocking on doors, and desperately trying to spin the situation in her favor. She went door to door, insisting she had been a VY Tim, that I had planted the police at her wedding to ruin her daughter's special day. She even tried to con VY NCE people that the ATF had no authority to raid a private family gathering, completely ignoring the fact that it had been a legal operation held on my land. Most people humored her, nodding along and pretending to sympathize. But behind closed doors, they were laughing. The great HOA queen had finally been dethroned, and no one was sad about it. Then she made her next mistake. She tried to sue me. A few weeks after the disaster, I received an official-looking letter from a lawyer's office, claiming I had willfully and maliciously disrupted a wedding and caused Margaret and her family severe emotional distress. The letter demanded financial compensation for irreparable reputational harm, and even tried to argue that I was responsible for the arrest of her husband and brother-in-law. I nearly laughed out loud reading it. I didn't even have to get a lawyer involved. I simply took the letter down to the county records office, pulled up the official property map, and highlighted the clear boundary lines that proved the land in question was legally mine. Then I sent a polite but firm response, attaching a copy of the police reports, the ATF's findings, and just for fun, a printout of Margaret's own social media posts where she had bragged about using the land without permission. That was the end of that lawsuit. Unfortunately for Margaret, that wasn't the end of her problems. With her husband's fraud case making headlines in the local news, the HOA members started asking questions about where their money had been going. As it turned out, Margaret had been dipping into HOA funds for years. She had used community money to pay for personal landscaping, home renovations, and most outrageously, deposits for her daughter's wedding expenses. That last revelation hit the neighborhood like a bombshell. People who had once tolerated her nonsense were now leave-VYD, realizing they had been paying into an HOA fund that Margaret had been treating like her personal piggy bank. An emergency HOA meeting was called. Normally, these meetings were poorly attended, with only a handful of members showing up. But this time, nearly everyone in the neighborhood crammed into the community center. Margaret, in typical Margaret fashion, showed up acting as if she still had control, standing at the front of the room with her usual smug confidence. That confidence shattered within minutes. One by one, people came forward with complaints, grievances, and accusations. They demanded to know where their money had gone. They brought up the wedding disaster, the illegal alcohol sales, the fines Margaret had handed out for ridiculous reasons. Some even admitted they had paid extra fees that had mysteriously never been documented. The final nail in the coffin was when someone, probably one of the more tech-savvy neighbors, pulled up bank statements showing HOA funds being transferred into Margaret's personal account. Margaret's excuses started strong, but they fell apart quickly. She tried blaming clerical errors, then overzealous bookkeeping, then me, claiming this was all part of my ongoing vendetta against her. But no one was buying it anymore. A vote was called. It wasn't even close. Margaret was officially removed as HOA president, effective immediately. She didn't take it well. She stormed out of the meeting, screaming about lawsuits and threatening to take everyone down with her. But the reality was, she was finished. Her power was gone, her influence destroyed, and within days, she and her family were hit with multiple lawsuits, not from me, but from the very people she had spent years terrorizing. Meanwhile, I was enjoying the peace and quiet of a Margaret-free existence. But I wasn't quite done yet. I had one final move left to make. With Margaret no longer in charge, the HOA started making major changes, rolling back some of the absurd rules she had put in place. But my personal favorite change? The HOA board voted to sell off some of the community-owned land to cover the financial losses Margaret had caused. I made an offer on a small but significant piece of land, one located directly next to Margaret's house. A month later, after all the paperwork was finalized, construction crews arrived. Margaret, still reeling from her fall from grace, came outside, hands on her hips, demanding to know what was happening. I stepped out, grinning. "Hey, Margaret," I said cheerfully. "I bought this lot." Her face paled. "You what?" "Oh yeah," I said, letting the suspense build for a moment. "I figured since you like planning events on my land so much, I should return the favor." She glared at me, her lips pressed into a thin line. "What are you doing with it?" I let the suspense build for a moment before casually saying, "Turning it into a dog park." The color drained from her face. Margaret hated dogs. She had spent years trying to keep pets out of the neighborhood, enforcing ridiculous rules about noise levels, leash lengths, and even the appropriate size of backyard doghouses. And now, right next to her home, she was going to have a fully operational dog park complete with agility courses, a water play area, and a section specifically for large, loud breeds. "You can't do that," she whispered, as if she couldn't even process the horror of it. I shrugged. I own the land. No HOA restrictions. For the first time in all the years I had known Margaret, she was truly, genuinely speechless. She just stood there, blinking, as if trying to wake up from a nightmare. The dog park opened a few months later. It was an instant hit with the community. People brought their dogs every day, kids played, laughter filled the air, and Margaret? She stayed locked inside her house, peeking through the curtains, watching in horror as her worst nightmare unfolded in real time. Every once in a while, I'd catch her outside, glaring at me from her porch as I sat in my yard, sipping my coffee, enjoying the beautiful sound of barking dogs and happy people. Life was good. In the months that followed, the neighborhood underwent a transformation. Without Margaret's iron-fisted rule, people began to relax. The absurd fines and warnings stopped, and the sense of community that had been missing for so long began to return. The dog park became a central gathering spot, where neighbors would meet to chat while their dogs played. Margaret, on the other hand, became a recluse. She rarely left her house, and when she did, it was usually to glare at the dog park or mutter under her breath about how the neighborhood had gone to the dogs literally. As for me, I continued to enjoy my quiet life, knowing that I had played a small part in bringing justice to Willow Creek. Margaret's reign of terror was over, and the neighborhood was finally free to thrive. And every morning, as I sat on my porch with my coffee, watching the sun rise over the dog park, I couldn't help but smile. Justice, after all, is best served with a side of barking dogs. As the months turned into a year, the neighborhood of Willow Creek continued to flourish. The dog park became a symbol of the community's newfound freedom, a place where laughter and joy replaced the tension and fear that Margaret Hargrove had once instilled. Kids played fetch with their dogs, neighbors chatted over coffee, and even the occasional yoga class was held on the grassy lawn. It was everything a community should be: warm, welcoming, and free from the petty tyranny of an HOA dictator. But while the rest of the neighborhood moved on, Margaret remained trapped in her own personal hell. Her once impeccable lawn began to wilt, the hedges grew unruly, and the curtains in her house stayed drawn tight. She had become a ghost in her own home, a shadow of the woman who had once ruled Willow Creek with an iron fist. Rumors began to circulate about her. Some said she had become a recluse, refusing to answer the door or even step outside. Others claimed they had seen her pacing her backyard late at night, muttering to herself about how the neighborhood had betrayed her. But no one really knew for sure. Margaret had become a mystery, a cautionary tale whispered about at block parties and barbecues. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves began to turn golden and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke, Margaret finally snapped. The constant barking from the dog park, the laughter of children, and the sight of her neighbors enjoying the life she had tried so hard to control became too much for her to bear. She stormed out of her house, her hair disheveled and her eyes wild. She marched straight to the dog park, where a group of neighbors were gathered, watching their dogs play. Without warning, she began screaming at them, her voice shrill and unhinged. "This is my neighborhood," she shrieked. "You're all ruining it. You've turned it into a circus." The neighbors stared at her in stunned silence. No one knew what to say. Margaret had always been difficult, but this was something else entirely. She was unraveling before their eyes. I was sitting on my porch, sipping my coffee, when I heard the commotion. I walked over to the dog park, curious to see what was happening. By the time I arrived, Margaret was in full meltdown mode, while VYing her arms and shouting at anyone who would listen. "Ew," she screamed when she saw me. "This is all your fault. You destroyed my life." I crossed my arms and leaned against the fence, watching her with a calm expression. "Margaret," I said, my voice steady, "you did this to yourself. You brought this on yourself with your greed, your lies, and your need to control everything." Her face twisted in rage, but before she could respond, one of the neighbors stepped forward. It was Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who had lived in Willow Creek for decades. She had always been quiet and reserved, but now she spoke with a firmness that surprised everyone. "Margaret," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "you've made this neighborhood miserable for years. You've fined people for the smallest things, you've stolen from the HOA, and you've treated everyone like they were beneath you. It's time for you to leave." The other neighbors nodded in agreement. Margaret looked around, her face pale, as if realizing for the first time that she had no allies left. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she turned on her heel and stormed back to her house, slamming the door behind her. The incident at the dog park was the final straw for Margaret. A few days later, a for sale sign appeared in her front yard. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood, and soon everyone was talking about it. No one knew where she was going or what she planned to do, but no one really cared. All that mattered was that she was Leah VYing. The house sold quickly, and within a month, Margaret was gone. She left without a word, without a goodbye, and without any explanation. It was as if she had simply vanished, Leah VYing behind only the memory of a reign of terror. With Margaret gone, the neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. The HOA elected a new president, someone who believed in fairness and community rather than control and punishment. The absurd rules were abolished, and the fines stopped. Willow Creek became the kind of place where people wanted to live, not the kind of place they felt trapped in. As for me, I continued to enjoy my quiet life. The dog park remained a source of joy for the neighborhood, and I took pride in knowing that I had played a small part in making it happen. I still sat on my porch every morning, sipping my coffee and watching the world wake up. But now, instead of tension and fear, there was peace and happiness. One morning, as I sat on my porch, a young couple walked by with their golden retriever. They stopped to chat, thanking me for the dog park and telling me how much it had changed their lives. It was moments like these that reminded me why I had done what I did. Margaret Hargrove had tried to control everything, but in the end, she had lost it all. And while I didn't take pleasure in her downfall, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction knowing that justice had been served. Years passed, and Willow Creek continued to thrive. The dog park became a beloved landmark, and the neighborhood became known for its strong sense of community. People moved in, drawn by the friendly atmosphere and the beautiful surroundings. And while Margaret's name was still mentioned from time to time, it was always as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked. As for me, I remained in my home, content with the life I had built. I still sat on my porch every morning, sipping my coffee and watching the sun rise over the dog park. And every now and then, as I listened to the sound of barking dogs and laughing children, I would smile and think to myself, justice, after all, is best served with a side of barking dogs. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.